Hey guys, it's Baba and I'm back with another speed draw thing. Now some of you might have seen me do this during the streams, but I also did a little bit off stream too, so this is the full compilation of it. There will be links to prints of this down in the description, and here we go. I just kind of started it on a whim because it was something that I had on my list that I wanted to do, because it's a combination of a couple of different ideas of things that I want to improve on. So the main thing that I wanted to do was fur, another animal. I wanted to work out more trees and kind of textures in the back, and draw in leaves, specifically lighten them from the back so that we've got a little bit of subsurface scattering going on. I also wanted to get a bit of backlight on the fur and see if I could light it correctly. So I tried to work all those different things into one thing and decided to do a red panda. Now my little thumbnail sketches aren't great, but I'm just trying to figure out the composition and what kind of pose I want him in first without putting a whole lot of effort into it and deciding maybe after spending a while in a sketch that I actually don't really like it. So eventually I go through all of these, about 9 of them in total, and I get to this one where I start to figure out a little bit more the lighting that I want as well and working that in, and the basic composition. And once I'm okay with that, I'm going to make it bigger, and we're going to actually try and draw it out decently this time now that we've got a little basic idea of where everything's going and where the lighting's going to be and how that's going to affect the composition as well. I'm also trying to pull in a little bit more of perspective into this so that we're looking upwards towards the panda, and so I'm blocking in just curves around the tree trunks so that it's a bit easier for me to tell the kind of perspective that we're looking at it from and what kind of angles of this tree we're going to see. And by doing that, I'm also building the environment to put this panda in when I do draw him. You guys have also said to me that you prefer these videos when they're a little bit slower, so I've started reducing them to about half the speed, so hopefully this is a little bit easier to follow. I don't want to make them too long so that I can narrate them a little bit more easily and I don't waste too much time when I could be drawing. But let me know if this is easier to follow. You can see as well with the little trick I'm doing by using just a green pen over the top to try and figure out where I want this composition to go before I go and plot everything in very certainly. When I've still got a bit of a sketch going on, I will do that over the top just to check that my eye is being led around it in a good way, and if not, it's easy for me to go and change any little bits that could help. Like for example, on some parts of the tree branches, I've curved them up a little bit more so that you don't get led directly off into a corner, you sort of curve up a little bit more. It's a really useful thing to do, and what you ideally want is to create a circuit that loops back on itself and completes. I'm also going to go and put a few leaves in over the top, though this is just a little bit sketchy right now. I do want some of them to be overlapping the panda so that it makes it look like it's got a little bit more depth. But I'm also using that to frame it a little bit as well. You can see, especially like around the corners, it's more heavy with the leaves and they are curved so that you don't kind of wander and look off into the corners too much. And now that I've got my basic shapes down for everything and the composition is okay, I'm starting again to just test out the lighting and see what I want to do with that and how it's going to light up the rest of the image. Now I kind of wanted it to light up a bit of a fur halo around him, and the rest of it just be filtering through the leaves and be quite dappled and not that strong further down in the image. I'm also going to have a little bit of bounce light from further down where maybe there's light bouncing up from where the sun's hitting the ground and coming back up through the leaves upwards, and we're also going to have that reflecting onto his tail and side of him. It is very important when you're drawing not to just think about the composition in terms of the shapes that you're drawing in, but the lighting is also going to have a big effect on that, which is why I usually use a glow layer over the top and put it in with an airbrush just to define the main points that the light's going to be hitting and where it's going to be fading out, or where there's going to be big blocks of shadow. And I'll usually do my little trick of drawing a circuit over the top to check that where my eye is being led comes around and completes itself into a circuit. Something that I'm also trying to do in terms of the composition is, because I'm going to have all this subsurface scattering inside the leaves, so they're going to be lit up quite saturated, that is going to also help with the composition. I'm going to have that framing around the panda, so where it's most saturated is probably going to be where you look first. It's going to be bright and saturated there, and I already know that my composition leads up to there, and that's where the circuit joins round and completes. So even at this stage, I'm trying to think about the entire rest of the process, all the way up to when it's going to be finished and I'm going to be putting the colours in. So I'm thinking about the drawing, as well as the lighting, the values that I'm going to have, and the colours at the same time. Now that I've got all this down and I've noodled the trees out a little bit more, I'm going to start drawing in the panda. I was a bit reluctant to get him plotted down at all until I got the trees done. He ends up looking a little bit strange at first because I couldn't quite get his nose right, but I go and redraw him in a second and he doesn't look kind of like a teddy bear that's had his face punched in. I really wanted to make sure that he didn't look goofy before I started trying to work it out anymore, but I didn't go and do line art for this. I thought the sketch was clean enough. I'm trying to get out of doing line art for things like this because it doesn't really seem appropriate to have the clean lines. It's much more help to have the sketchy lines where you can indicate a little bit of where the shadow is, or kind of hatch out where the form's going to be moving, especially with him who's got a load of fur on him. So instead of doing the lines, I just go around the edge of the sketch that I've got with a pen brush and then select around it and fill it in. I'm also going to be using a textured brush for the leaves, or a leaf brush that I had. I think it's from the Manga Studio website, or was. I'm not sure if it's still on there, but it was just one of the free ones that they had. So I'm going to be using that just for the base of it, and then I'm going to paint on top of them, but I'm just going to put them in block colours at first. But before that, we're going to start blocking all these in, like I mentioned, so I'm just going and drawing around each thing. I'm also going to be keeping the trees on slightly different layers, or each chunk of branches. So we've got this big chunk in the front that's got quite a lot of overlapping, and then I'm going to have the one that the panda's sat on, and then we're going to have some more that are a little bit more faded out into the background behind him. And then I'm selecting around it and inverting the selection and just filling them in. So that gives me a basic block, and from that I can like make a layer mask around it and put it on a different layer, so I can paint on top if I want, or I can put overlays on to add a little bit of variation in the colours, because I think doing this on one layer would be way too much. I'm also going to be doing it in Greyscale, so it's a little bit easier for me to separate everything and just go in and paint on those layers. Fixing his face a little bit. I went and got a whole bunch of different references so that I could make sure I was drawing his face in right and he wasn't going to look goofy. I've changed the curve of his nose so that he does have more of a snout, and there he's actually starting to look like a panda now. I made sure to block his face in just a little bit better than I did before. And now that that sketch is cleaned up, I can go around him and clean up his shape so that I've got a definite block for him to do. Now luckily red pandas are quite rounded anyway. All their fur seems to just stick up and make them have like a certain distance between like the body and the fur, so they're very, very rounded, so he wasn't too difficult to block out. And what I'm going to be doing later to clean that up, instead of having him just really crisp around the edges, is go and overpaint everything over the top. So now anyway, I've got all my basic shapes. I've reduced the opacity of the sketches over the top so I can see what I'm actually trying to paint over, and I'm starting to work in some values for everything. I'm going to be making the ones in the front darker so that we get a better reflection of the kind of lighting that I'm going to do. And now I'm just starting to paint everything on with a really washy airbrush set to the lowest hardness setting, which I normally wouldn't use or really want to use because it's not sharp enough. But when you're really zoomed out and it's at this stage of the painting, it can be quite helpful just to get your values in, especially if you're doing something very rounded like this furry little friend. Now, it might not be obvious as I start cleaning this up and going more into the painting and rendering, but as I go in, I'm going to start increasing the hardness of that airbrush where I am using it, and then once that's cleaned up to a point where I like it and I can sort of tell the form and the shape and the texture of everything enough to be able to remove the sketch over the top, I'm going to just start using a ink brush that is very just blocky and saturated and sharp to go and pick out any details, and I'm just going to use the eyedropper to pick the values and clean it up. You can see now I'm with a little bit harder of a brush, and starting to noodle in more values onto him and clean the shapes up a little bit, add some little harsher shapes onto it where the light's going to be hitting. What I also like to do, just to make it a little bit cleaner and easier to understand and to make the shadows a little bit sharper, I will render everything as though the light is hitting it without any kind of cast shadows from anything at first, so that I can later go and carve out the shape of the shadows with a sharp brush if I want it to be sharp, or a softer brush if I want it to be softer, but then you don't get any kind of awkward midlines in between. So you can see I've just gone and done it over the top there, and I don't have any awkward washy edges to that. I'm also going to be going and tweaking the values quite a lot, just as I slowly change what I'm doing with it, and making sure that the lighting looks correct. Just starting to mess about with the leaf brushes and figure out one that I want. So on this background it's just one flat layer, and I'm selecting a bunch of different values where the light's going to be shining through so that I can change the colours of them later, just so I've got that kind of dappled light look through the leaves. They also really don't have much shape to them at the moment. I am going to go and add the ones over the top on a different layer so that they don't interfere with anything else. But I will be going and overpainting them later and introducing different values into them depending on the shape of them. You can also see now where I put the little bit of bounce light in on the bottom of his arm, where it's getting a little bit lighter, and underneath his chin. You can also see it on the undersides of the branches and around the leaves at the bottom, where all the light from the ground is going to be bouncing up through the tree. I guess this isn't a very tall tree, and maybe the ground underneath it's quite light, but this little panda's just hiding up in the tree where it's a little bit more shady from the harsh sun outside. And I'm trying to not make that value too light so that it doesn't look like a completely different light source. It's just going to be a little bit of the light bouncing around in the tree and coming back up. Okay, so now, like I mentioned before, I've got the basic form of the tree down, so I can start to pick at that and add other little values to indicate where there's going to be texture in the back of the tree. So I'm getting some darker values and working those in, and picking ones that are already there and just working them into crispy shapes on the bark so that it's got a bit of texture in it. And all I really need to do is pick what's already there, because it is such a soft gradient on it already. I've got all the different shades that I need. I don't need to go over to my colour wheel and start picking other stuff. I just need to move them about a little bit, which would be far more difficult if you were to do it with colour. You probably would have to nip over to the colour wheel a little bit, but since we're just using greys, it's really, really easy. Like if you look into the right corner and look at my colour wheel, you can just see that it's staying down the edge on the left between the white and the black. And from this little view that I've stopped at now, you can tell that it's starting to come together and be understandable as a bit more of a rounded shape. It just needs all the textures putting on now, because everything just kind of looks like a doughy blob at the moment, but all the values look right and you can understand that it exists in a 3D space. You can understand where the light's coming from and where it's hitting. It's just adding little bits of detail and texture. Gonna have to wait a second for the panda though, because I got way too into noodling the trees at first, so we're gonna finish all the tree bark first and then work on the panda and the leaves in the background to bring them apart a little bit more, have them not look as stuffed together, I guess, like a bit too overdone at this point. I'm also going to be going and adding other little branches coming from the thin ones already up into the leaves, so that we've got a consistent line all the way through from the main trunk of the tree up to the leaves. And I'm also going to be, like I mentioned, painting more detail onto the leaves so they've got their own structure rather than just being a single value. But what I don't want is this tree trunk in the centre with a bunch of floating leaves around it. So I'm going to try and link as many of them as I can onto stalks and tree branches. And it looks like all this would be quite a quick process, but it actually isn't, especially when you're cleaning up just the rounded shapes and starting to put these textures in and making sure that the value's correct. You can see me going there in and just changing the values for everything just to make sure, and then going and applying it to different layers that I think need fixing, because it was getting a little bit too dark up in the foreground and it was making everything else look a bit overexposed. Sometimes I'll also just go over things completely if I don't like the way that they're looking. I'll go back over them with a single value or like more blocky values, so it's a little bit easier when I go and put more detail in. But I don't want to be scared of going and undoing things or going back over things to return them to kind of a base state in case I don't like what I've done to it. I don't want to be scared of trying to redo things and get rid of work that I've done, because it's pretty much always going to be better the second time around. Now, in terms of timescale, we're nearly about a third of the way in. This thing in total took me around 20 to 21 hours, I think, which is a little bit better. I expected it to take me a lot longer, like maybe 25 hours plus, because the last thing that I did that was a similar style with the gradient maps and everything was the tiger that I drew. I will put a link to the video of that one at the end, which took me about 25 hours. So with this one that's got way more detail going on for the environment and background, I expected that to take me way longer, but I must have improved in between because I didn't expect it to take me that much less time. Also, if you guys have got suggestions for other animals that you'd like to see me paint, put them down in the comments and I will consider them, because I would quite like to do a set of these and continually compare the sort of times that it takes me to complete them and continue to develop my shading and blocking out of values and rendering with Greyscale and figuring out new ways to colour Greyscale things, which I'm going to mention is another thing that I think may have improved my time. I was going to say score then. Improved my time score for this one. Instead of going with gradient maps, which I do initially go and have a bit of a play with, I decide eventually to go and colour it with just different overlay layers and keep it a little bit more muted than I usually do so that it isn't as saturated, but we'll get to that when we get to the colours once we've mostly rendered everything. Anyway, so now I've got all the tree branches done, nicely rendered out, well, enough rendered out so that I can go and noodle it a bit more once I've got the colours on. I'm gonna go and paint in the panda, and I'm just changing the values a little bit because he does have some parts of him that are lighter because they're white, so I'm gonna do that on a separate layer. I'm just copying the layer that he's on already, changing the values slightly on it, and now I've got two different layers where I've erased the lighter one over the top to give me the darker spaces underneath. Then I'm going to merge those down into one, and now what I'm starting to do is I'm getting a little bit fed up of the painting. I'm getting sick of rendering it, so I'm having a little bit of a play with colours on an overlay layer over the top, starting to think about where I'm going to be going next with it once I get to the colours, in the same kind of fashion that I did with trying to figure out the lighting with a glow layer earlier when I just had the sketch. Anyways, now you can see the panda's starting to come together. He's got a little bit more form to him now. We're starting to pick out all these different values. Now with the tiger that I did, this was also something that I wanted to focus on, using two different values to have markings in a certain thing. So I know his arms are going to be darker than his body. They're more of a dark red. His body's more of an orange. And he's got all these little white markings on his face, and he's got stripes on his tail. Now on the tiger with the stripes and everything, I kept those on two different layers for the different values, but with this I want to try painting them together, so I've merged them down together like I just mentioned, and I'm going to start going in now and painting the fur on, and I'm trying to keep it having this deep look to it, so we can just see the edges of some of these furs highlighted. Especially from the bounce light that's coming from underneath him. So we've got just the ends of the fur being lit up, but all the dark underneath. What I had a bit of an issue with was when I zoomed out, he still just kind of looked very rounded and doughy. So I'm trying to make some of the fur a little bit thicker, but I don't want to make it incredibly thick because it's just going to look really, really blocky then. But they do only have fine furs. And they are very round in general, but I'm trying to introduce like some little creases and wrinkles, so around where his arm's being pulled around, he's going to have that little bunch of fur around his neck. He's going to have a tiny bit around under his arm. I'm also going to make it look like he's kind of squished up against that branch, so his fur is going to be pushed inwards a little bit, so I'm going to add a little bit of dark around that. I'm going to have the light hitting the base of his tail as well, or the tip of his tail, to light that up a little bit more as the light's coming through. you can see on the end of his tail I have made the fur a little bit too thick, like the brush is a bit too big. But I'm going to go and thin that out a bit. I'm also going to go and plump up the rest of his tail more so that it looks like it's got more fur on it, especially where the light's going to be hitting it. We're going to get these furry edges to where it transitions from having a dark stripe to a light stripe. And also a few little bits between where the light and the shadow sit in. And now I'm going to go and mess with his face a little bit, and looking at the reference photos I noticed that the hair was a little bit thinner just below his ears, between the eyes and where it goes up into the ears. So I left the gradient underneath and put the little white hairs over the top. This tends to be a theme with like furry things with sticky up ears, like on cats you can usually see where the hair's a little bit thinner by there. I'm just checking my sketch occasionally as well. It's pretty much blocked out enough for it to be fine, but I'm just checking the placement as I'm starting to carve things out a little bit more. Like I've moved the block on his cheek up a little bit. I think I'm actually doing all this fur on a separate layer over the top as well, just so that I have the kind of doughy round version underneath, so I can turn off this scratchy layer and just compare it. And adding in more fur onto his face to add the texture in, because it tends to look a lot more grainy around the face, where, especially around the lips and things, where the fur does thin out a bit. He's gonna have black lips, so I need to bring that shade in a little bit more. I need to put shine onto his nose and round it out more. I need to clean his eyes up. I'm also trying to keep this gradient of the tear stripe down his face and not make that too dark, but have it just soften out as it gets up to being around his eyes. I also wanted to light up the end of his nose so that there's going to be a lot of light hitting his whiskers, even though they're curved down, especially around the left side of his face, or right side now that I've flipped him, left side again. I'm just adding a little bit more detail onto his nose. I don't want it to look flat, and now I'm just going and adding a few more shadows in and making sure that they make sense over things. I wasn't quite sure about the form of everything and what kind of place in space it was, so I needed a few extra little ones, especially just for the twigs that were hanging about. Just moving them about and cleaning them up. Adding some more light into the background. The panda's eye is also looking a little bit creepy now because I've only put a little bit of bounce light on where there's going to be a tiny bit at the bottom. But that's going to be noodled out a little bit more later once I put the colours in. I don't really like to mess with the eyes too much because if you overwork them they can look really bad, so I prefer to leave them until last. Now I'm starting to put more details into the leaves like I mentioned before. I'm keeping the ones that are going to have all the light coming through them quite bright because they're going to be really saturated as we're getting that subsurface scattering through them, so it's going to illuminate basically the local colour of the leaf. Adding in more stalks and little details onto them to fix them up and join them into everything, and we're going to add some leaves into the front now. I'm trying to get them all in the right place to fill it in nice. I ended up actually adding a lot less than I did in the initial sketch or my basic planning kind of idea for them, because I thought I quite liked the background a lot more, or too much to go and cover it completely in leaves in the foreground, that I intend to blur out slightly. I also want to make a note that all of these little twigs that I'm putting in as extra and details on the leaves are on a separate layer over the top of everything, just so it's a little bit easier for me to keep it separate and not have it blur in, or not have to go in on each separate layer and try and figure out which leaf should be on which layer. Okay, so this is getting to the point where it's nearly ready for me to start colouring. I just want to add a little bit of colour to the leaves, well, not colour but different values. So the way I'm going to go about that at first is to get an airbrush and just go over the top of everything. I've got some that I've made darker just because they're going to be a bit further forward and more in shadow, and there's some that are lighter that I'm going to put a little bit more dark on, so it's giving me the basic shape for them. And once I put colour on that, it's going to give me a little bit of colour variation, and it'll be easy for me to just select the different colours that I have down already and paint them in. And now that I've got all those in the foreground done, I'm starting to add the stems on those and trying not to forget to put all the values. Instead of just the stem, I'm remembering to put the highlight and any bounce light I can onto it. If there's going to be any light hitting it, just resolving any little issues I've got down the bottom, which is going to be blurred out slightly, but I don't want it to be completely scraggy. And moving on now, just keeping noodling everything. I kept finding little bits that I wanted to go and fix before I started messing with anything. And then soon we should be moving on to the gradient maps. Like I said before, I was originally going to go and do this in gradient maps, so basically selecting each layer separately, which is why I've got like the trees and the panda on different layers, and adding in a gradient from basically black to white in different colours so that it colorizes what I've already got in these different shades. But I really didn't like the way that looked once I put it in on the different layers. I thought this is going to end up far too saturated, so I ended up dropping it and getting rid of all that stuff that I'd put in and just going over the top with the similar to the overlay layer that I did before to test it out to see if that was a viable way of going and colorizing a basically gradient drawing in black and white. At this point I also noticed that there wasn't really much contrast going on between the branches of the trees, so I went back in underneath one of the layers for the tree branches and added in a bit of a washy layer so that it gave us a little bit more contrast down there. And at this point I'm going and putting all the gradient maps in for each different layer, and this is when I'm starting to decide that maybe it is a little bit too saturated. I kept the kind of idea that I was going for with the overlay colours that I picked, so we're going for more blue shadows and more yellowish highlights, and this probably would have been viable if I didn't pick such saturated colours, and I could have gone and put some more little variations in colour with the overlay over the top, but having such saturated colours underneath is just going to make it even worse once I try and put overlay on it. So at this point I pretty much just scrap it because I think it doesn't look right. I try flipping the overlay on and off it and reducing the saturation and everything, but I still don't like the way that it looks. So we're going to go in over just another layer where I'm going to copy all the layers I've already got, and we're going to start going over the top of that and the little overlay layer that I've already done. If you want to watch me go and do one actually with the gradient layers, I'll put a link to the tiger one that I mentioned that I did a few months ago at the end of the video. What I am trying to do with this is reduce the saturation, so when I am going to put in a layer of overlay on the top, I'm kind of doing it pretty full on at first and then going and reducing it over the top. I'm messing about with a few different layer modes. I think I end up with maybe 2 or 3 different layers of overlay, because I'll put one over the top, make it quite washy like it is at the moment, and then I'll do another one and I'll bring out some more of the colours in places that I want it to pop, like put a bit more on the panda there. I'm going to put a little bit more green around the top where I want a lot more light to be bouncing around. Also going to go in a minute onto one of the layers underneath and fill in some of the areas that I just have as a flat grey so that we get a much brighter colour and all the subsurface scattering through the leaves. Now, looking at the time for this and where everything kind of stops and starts, I've noticed that the colouring on these usually takes about 1/3 of the time. So 2/3 we're going to be drawing and sketching and like going and cleaning the painting up, and then the end bit is going to be me sorting the colour out, but there is going to be a chunk of that where I go and, like I mentioned before, I like to overpaint it. So I'll get all these colours down, and once I'm happy with them and I know that I'm not going to change them, I will make another layer over the top and start using the eyedropper to pick colours and go and paint over the top, just to pick any other little details out with the colour that I like the look of. Now at this point it's starting to look a little bit awkward because we've got a bit too much white around his head, so I'm going and changing the colour of these leaves on a different layer, just using the fill tool because they've all been done just in a single colour underneath, and that's letting me make those a bit more saturated. I can also put a little bit of overlay over the top of them, but once I've got those in, all in the flat colours that I want, what I'm going to do is go and add some more details into the leaves by overpainting, but I think it's around this point where I get to where I am happy with the colours, and I'll make a new layer over the top and I start going in, like zooming in and just going and painting more little details in over the top using the colours that are there, You can see I've got a little bit more green bouncing around. I'm starting to noodle out any little bits that I didn't really have enough rendering on. So we're putting some more tree bark up in the top here, bringing those green colours that we've put on with the overlay into it to have that bouncing about, starting to put a bit more shading on the leaves and show that they've got a little bit more shape to them rather than just being flat. And at this point, I mean, it probably does look rendered enough, but I'm going to keep going over everything and rendering it. I usually render things to the point where I don't need the sketch over it anymore to tell what the shape is. Like you can tell the shape if you zoom out or if you zoom in. It just looks a little bit scruffy if you do zoom in, so I'm going and noodling more, cleaning little bits up now that I've got all the colours that I want down. I'm not really into hyper realistic stuff or kind of aiming for realistic in terms of the rendering. I still want this to look a little bit painty, but potentially what I could do now that I've got all these colours is just keep going closer and closer and increasing the zoom higher and higher so that I can keep zooming in and keep picking at it and painting until it does look that kind of state. But I think it depends what kind of point you want to stop it at, what point you think it's done. There's nothing wrong with having a painting style that maybe doesn't render as much as mine does, or one that renders more than mine does. It just really depends on your preference, because it depends on what kind of look you want at the end, and it depends how much time you want to spend on it, because at the start, I probably would have taken a bit of a different stance in the way that I started painting. I probably wouldn't have gone straight in with the airbrush if I had a bit of a simpler art style. I likely would have gone in there with a bit more of a blocky brush straight away so that the values were a bit more blocky and ready for me to go and pick at more. Something that's bothering me with this at the moment, or was bothering me at the moment when I was painting this, was that the glow around the panda's head was kind of the same value as the sky behind it, which I had a bit of an issue with, but I tend to leave putting final little highlights on till last, so my intention was to go and put a glowy halo of where the fur's all being lit up around the edges right at the end, so that I can go and put in a lighter value all the way around his head so that he stands out a little bit more from the background. And it does look a little bit awkward at the moment, but it will look better once I get the thing in. It's just, I'm not sure how to get around it a little bit earlier in the process, where I don't really want to go and add those in, like those little details at the end, in too soon, because I don't want to have to go and paint over them and clean them up if I do them kind of scruffy just to block the values in. But it can kind of throw off the whole feeling of the painting not to have them there anyway. Just to have that as a reference and a colour or a value that's going to affect the rest of the piece. Something that I might have gone a little bit overboard with too is putting the bounce light onto the panda, especially on his front leg, where his fur is a little bit darker. I kind of like the grey that's on it, but I think there might be a little bit too much, or it's not faded out enough, it's too much of a big block. We can't really see a lot of the fur texture in the bottom of it. It's also quite strong on the end of its tail. And like I mentioned, I'm not trying to get this completely realistic, and I kind of wanted to practice my bounce light, so I made it a bit stronger than it probably would be naturally, but I think it is a little bit out of hand just on the end of his tail. Something that I do like about it though is that I actually managed to keep it not too saturated. It's not really oversaturated and overexposed like in some of the things that I paint and draw. And the background I've managed to keep fairly watercolory. Like you can see all the different little gradients around the bottom where there's a gap in the trees and it's just leaves. And like I mentioned before, there's all that halo around his head with the glow, and I'm just going and putting in some other little details like his whiskers to fix them up, because I like to leave things like that till last, and the details in his eye. I'm also getting a little bit of the fuzz highlighted on the end of his nose, because he looks fine when it's zoomed out, but when you zoom in more, he doesn't look that great, and I want this to look good as a print, so I'm going in and just picking at his face a little bit more so that he is more detailed, since he is the main focus point. And now I'm trying to paint in his eye and not make him look super creepy, trying to get a little bit of glow in it to lighten it up a bit, and making sure that I get that little bit of bounce light that's going to be coming from where the end of his nose is lit up and reflecting that onto the eye. and just going in and cleaning the nose up a little bit, putting some more light onto it. They've actually got really kind of dog-looking noses except for they're rounder. I go and put another little bit of glow over the top and just do a few more little bits of painting to put any little highlights on the stems for the leaves. And I'm trying to stay quite zoomed out while I'm doing this because I'm trying to, now that it's near enough finished, look at it as a whole and see if there are any tiny little bits that are missing from it. And just a few little bits to darken the bottom up to fix the kind of values that I want a little bit better. And this is done. It's a little bit of a closer look so you can see some more of the details. And yeah, there we go, there he is. I hope this helped. If it did, give us a like, share if you think it'll help someone else, and subscribe for new videos on Fridays. There'll be a link on the screen to where you can go and get prints of this dude, as well as down in the description with some other links to where I post stuff, as well as where my commission information is. Yeah, I hope this helped. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.